Thank you guys for being here today. We have a large group and for our talk on antisocial personality disorder. This is the second talk in a series of talks that I am doing on cluster B personality disorder. So in the spring of this year, prior to COVID, I did a presentation on a narcissistic personality disorder, and that's available at the hopeandhealingcenter.org, hopeandhealingcenter.org. You can find that presentation because it's related to this, because it's also a cluster B personality disorder. So let's just jump in and talk about antisocial personality disorder. Hopefully, what we'll do today is learn a little bit more about the disorder, what it is, how you treat it, and how to interact with people that have the problem, but also break some of the myths associated with antisocial personality disorder, just like I did when we discussed narcissistic personality disorder. So what is a personality disorder? I think that's a very important place to start. Personality disorder is different than, say, a mental illness or a mental disorder. Personality disorder is a long-lasting, rigid pattern of maladaptive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So this is a very kind of deeply seated change in how the individual experiences life and how they behave. They have learned and biologically been driven to a set of beliefs and behaviors that are contrary to what the culture around them would say is appropriate. And so this goes for any of the personality disorders that are listed in the DSM. So this is not something where an individual, for instance, like with depression, where a person would be have a normal mood state, and then it would come upon them, a depressive episode would come upon them, and then once they get through that depressive episode, they would no longer be considered depressed. This is something that happens at an early age, and then is really a long-lasting, kind of almost a permanent state, although we will talk about some treatment options. So there are a number of personality disorders that are listed in the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is a Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is what we use to diagnose individuals with mental disorders. You can see that there are 3 clusters of personality disorders. Cluster A is your more what's considered odd and eccentric. Common features, as I've listed there: social awkwardness and social withdrawal, distorted thinking. Cluster C is the anxious, fearful cluster, and disorders, or all those personality disorders, have very high levels of anxiety. And we today are talking about antisocial personality disorder, which is in the cluster B. Same thing with narcissistic. The dramatic, erratic cluster. These tend to have a lack of impulse control, and there's a lot of problems with emotional regulation. And there's a significant overlap between these 4 personality disorders, although there is some distinct features as well. So we will be talking about antisocial personality disorder today. All right, so what is antisocial personality disorder? It is a pattern of behavior that involves the manipulation, exploitation, violation of the rights of others. Okay, so you may have heard a lot of different things about antisocial personality disorder. They indeed do lie a lot. They're very deceitful. They lack remorse for the actions that they commit, which typically are manipulative or criminal in nature, and they really will not conform easily to social norms or laws. And so we're going to talk about the criminality that's involved with antisocial personality disorder as well. You may have heard other terms that are related, such as being a psychopath, or sometimes what's referred to as psychopathy. All psychopaths would have antisocial personality disorder, but not all antisocial personality disordered individuals would be considered psychopaths. Psychopath or psychopathy is not a term that's used in the diagnostics manual. It is not a diagnosis. It is more of a descriptive feature of an individual who is superficially charming, deceitful, manipulative, similar to what we're describing here with antisocial personality disorder, but it would really be best thought of as a subset of antisocial personality disorder, or a subtype. It's kind of a more callous, unemotional, person lacks even less conscience than someone with antisocial personality disorder. Some of the other myths around antisocial personality disorder, not everyone with antisocial personality disorder is a serial killer. Certainly every serial killer that you've ever heard of has antisocial personality disorder, but not all people with antisocial personality disorder become serial killers. Those would just be a very small subset of people. So antisocial personality disorder, again, is this pattern of behavior that's involved in manipulation and exploitation, rule violations, breaking laws, lying. And we'll go through the criteria in a few minutes to get a sense of really what it takes to meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. And I'll say the same thing now that I said when I went through narcissistic personality disorder earlier this spring. Uh, just because a person is kind of a jerk, not very nice, or even lies or breaks rules, does not mean they have antisocial personality disorder. You're going to see it's a relatively high threshold to meet the criteria for that. And one of the kind of classic features of anything that's referred to as a disorder is that it impairs the individual's ability to function in some sphere of their life. And in this instance, most likely in their work or in their relationships. And so people that have antisocial personality disorder do not just simply function in society normally. I mean, there are going to be some exceptions, but typically they are struggling to function within normal society. All right, so let's look at the epidemiology of the disorder. About 2 to 3% of the population, the general population, has been suggested to have antisocial personality disorder, but you find that 60% of male prisoners meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So it's very common in prison populations. It occurs in the late teens to early adulthood is when it will be diagnosed. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer there. You actually have to be 18 or older to actually receive the diagnosis according to the Diagnostics manual. So we will talk about some earlier behaviors that are displayed by individuals who are going to ultimately or subsequently have antisocial personality disorder. The diagnosis is 3 times more common in men than it is in women, although certainly women can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. There is a heritable aspect. It's been suggested that at least 50% of the variation in this type of behavior is accounted for by genetics. I have seen studies that go as high as 70%. So there is clearly a heritable aspect to this. So it does run in families, but there's also a heavy heavy environmental component as well. So we'll talk about that as we go through. There are a number of co-occurring disorders. It's very common for people with antisocial personality disorder to also be substance users or have a substance use disorder. In fact, 80% of individuals that are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder will also have a substance use disorder. So that's extremely common. Depression is also common, as are anxiety disorders. People with antisocial personality disorder often have very high levels of anxiety. Impulse control problems like intermittent explosive disorder, and then certainly the other cluster B personality disorders like borderline and narcissistic overlap pretty significantly with this. So you will find individuals with antisocial personality disorder that may indeed meet the criteria for other personality disorders or have at least the traits of other personality disorders. So cluster B is kind of a messy cluster where there's a lot of overlap in these issues. But the substance use issue is significant when it comes to antisocial personality disorder. It's rare to find someone who has it, who hasn't struggled with alcohol or drug dependence. There are a number of risk factors. This is just a short list of kind of the more common risk factors for individuals. And primarily what you're looking at are factors that would be predictive of a child later showing antisocial personality disorder as an adult. Hyperactivity and inattention is very common in these individuals as children, as is academic failure, particularly low IQ or language issues. An alcoholic or criminal father is highly predictive of an individual. And what you have there is you have both the genetics of an individual who likely has antisocial personality disorder, but you're also being raised by somebody who may have antisocial personality disorder. Childhood abuse or neglect increases the risk. Association with a deviant peer group. And then, of course, there's some prenatal related things, prenatal exposure to alcohol or drugs or any type of toxin, and then obstetric complications. And those kind of link back to the beginning with hyperactive and inattention. Anything that would cause a child to have hyperactivity and inattention early on kind of sets them on a path where they're at higher risk for having some of these other types of issues, and then ultimately antisocial personality disorder. So let's look at the diagnostic criteria and let's talk about really, what would it take for an individual to meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder? Again, as with a lot of mental health problems, I think we tend to focus on maybe a singular criterion or a specific aspect of the disorder, and kind of think everyone who shows that has the disorder, much like we just think of someone that's sad as depressed, and that's far from depression. Sadness is sadness, depression is a disorder. And so let's look at this and really get a sense of what it means. So, as I said before, pervasive pattern of a disregard for violation of rights of others since the age of 15. So, I think that's a very important thing to realize here. And we're going to look at some developmental strategies here in a moment. But we have to understand that a person does not simply have a normal childhood. Everything was fine through childhood and adolescence, and they turn 18 years old, and all of a sudden they become antisocial personality disordered. That's just not how this works. The developmental trajectory occurs much earlier. The child would have struggled with different issues, and to even meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, as you will see at the bottom there in the note, I have the child has to have shown evidence, or the person has to have shown evidence of conduct disorder prior to 15 years old. We're going to look at the conduct disorder criteria in just a minute. So just keep that in mind, that this individual, let's say that they've turned 18 or 19 now, they will have already been struggling for many years with similar types of behaviors prior to receiving the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. In my own experience, where I've spent most of my career working with people that have aggression and personality disorders, it is very rare, very uncommon to come across someone who has antisocial personality disorder that had a pristine adolescence and childhood where they were not exposed to violence or abuse or poverty or things like that. It's rare to see someone who had a good upbringing and then antisocial personality disorder occurs. So if we look at the first criteria, you have to meet 3 of the following in addition to having conduct disorder prior to age 15. So failure to conform to social norms concerning lawful behaviors. So as I said before, 60% of jail or prison inmates meet criteria for antisocial personality disorder. But it's very important to realize that criminality is not a requirement for an individual to meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder. As I said just a moment ago, 3 of the following are necessary, and so criminal behavior is not necessary, although it's rather common in people with antisocial personality disorder. Deceitfulness, repeated lying, use of aliases. So the person is very manipulative and they lie. They're impulsive and they do not plan ahead. Irritable and aggressive, often involved in physical fights or assaults. But again, this is another common misconception. Aggression is not a necessary part of the diagnosis. It certainly is possible for a person to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and never have displayed any aggressive behavior. Reckless disregard for the safety of others, consistent irresponsibility, failure to sustain working behavior, or honor monetary obligations. It's very common in people with antisocial personality disorder that they go from job to job to job. They're unable to keep jobs for very long periods of time because they do not do well with authority figures or any type of rules. And they also find themselves in debt quite often because they borrow money. And they also have a tendency to not pay back those loans or pay back for things that they've purchased on credit and things like that. So they often find themselves in pretty significant financial straits. Lack of remorse, being indifferent to or rationalizing hurting others, mistreating or stolen things stolen from others. And so they do lack remorse. They tend to, this is often thought of as kind of a lack of conscience. They really don't have much of a conscience, but we're going to talk about why that is. Why is it that they aren't really affected by the things that they do? Why does it not make them feel bad when they hurt other people? Antisocial personality disordered individuals tend to kind of live by the mantra that, the ends justify the means. They do what they do simply to obtain what they need. And it really doesn't really bother them if others are hurt or if there are negative consequences. They seem to almost live by trial and error. But the reality is that they don't really learn. So they're not, because the consequences don't really bother them. So negative consequences aren't really negative to them. They're just simply consequences and a kind of a nuisance in some sense. So again, you have to have three of the five, or I'm sorry, three of the seven at least to meet criteria, and you must have had conduct disorder before the age of 15. So those of you who tuned in, just like people that came to the narcissistic personality disorder presentation because you feel that your family member is antisocial personality disordered, just like many of the people at the other one felt their family member was narcissistic. It's important that they have to have met criteria for conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. If that's true, then they have to have three of these five, or of these seven, at least three of these seven occurring right now. And so let's look at conduct disorder for a minute, because not everyone that met criteria for conduct disorder was diagnosed with conduct disorder. It's certainly possible that the individual was never diagnosed. It's very similar diagnostic criteria as from antisocial personality. In fact, in some sense, it's been referred to as kind of baby antisocial personality disorder or adolescent antisocial personality disorder. So you're looking at an individual who is repetitive and persistent pattern of behavior that really violates the rights of others, and they don't conform to social norms. They have to have at least three of the following 15 criteria over the past 12 months, and at least one has to have occurred in the last 6 months. And you can see it's a variety of antisocial, aggressive, and kind of criminal behavior. So you only have to have three of the 15. And so, you can imagine if you look at this again, often bullies or threatens, intimidates others, initiates physical fights, physically cruel to animals. It's a whole set of aggressive behaviors, destruction of property, there's deceitfulness, lying, stealing, and then a whole set of kind of violations like truancy and runaways. So children who do this, consistently can be diagnosed with conduct disorder. And if the individual is diagnosed with conduct disorder prior to the age of 15, then they are on a trajectory for antisocial personality disorder unless there's some type of intervention. I think it's important to understand that only about a quarter of individuals that are diagnosed with conduct disorder will go on to have antisocial personality disorder. So it's not, kind of a one-to-one type of match. And interventions certainly do exist that are effective at helping individuals that have conduct disorder. The more important thing is that certainly individuals who have early onset conduct disorder, the conduct disorder is occurring around 8 to 10 years old, those individuals are at a much higher risk of later antisocial personality disorder. That's a much more serious form of conduct disorder than conduct disorder that occurs in a little bit later adolescence. All right, so understanding that we have to have conduct disorder to get to antisocial personality disorder, then we have to have a set of these kind of deceitful and law-breaking or rule-violating behaviors once the individual turns 18 years old to actually be diagnosed. And I think another qualifier, as I've said before, is the individual, these types of behaviors, this type of thought process, this type of personality causes the individual to not be functional in some sphere of their daily life, be that work, school, or relationships. You're not antisocial personality disordered and you're just kind of getting through life fine, and no one seems to know that you're antisocial personality disorder. Again, that's kind of a misconception, is that, there are, psychopaths hiding among us. But remember, psychopath is a different concept. It's related, but different. Antisocial personality disordered individuals are not hiding among us and we don't know who they are. Antisocial personality disordered individuals are involved in behaviors that we are recognizing as antisocial. All right, so if we want to look at a kind of a suggested developmental strategy, this is not an uncommon trajectory for an individual who has antisocial personality disorder. So you see that the child has, at the preschool age, has ADHD, or at least the hyperactivity and inattention that's associated with ADHD. That will then lead to oppositional and defiant behaviors and school problems. As you can see, as they move into the middle school time, there's a diagnosis there of oppositional defiant disorder. Then you will see this disengagement and withdrawal because the child is being rejected, they're getting in trouble, they start to have academic problems, and you see the early onset of conduct disorder. So at that point, the child's probably 8 to 10 years old. You see this early onset conduct disorder. So now they're involved in these kind of antisocial like behaviors as a child. truancy, lying, stealing, hurting animals, hurting others, bullying others. And then you see the association with the delinquent peer group as they move into adolescence, then the use of drugs and alcohol and involvement with criminality. So you have a substance use disorder, a diagnosis there, and kind of mid to late adolescence. And then as they move into adulthood, you see criminality begin, the more overt criminality, and you may see some incarceration and then some recidivism in that, and then you receive an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis. So I think what's important to understand here, again, is if you are concerned that your loved one has antisocial personality disorder or someone you know, this is not an uncommon trajectory for someone who has antisocial personality disorder. It is, you do not become an adult and then suddenly you get antisocial personality disorder. That is certainly possible for an individual to have had a perfectly normal personality development, be an adult and acquire a head injury or some type of brain insult, an infection, a tumor, and it would alter their personality and they could then show antisocial kind of impulsive traits. So that's certainly possible, but that's a rare instance. So a person who's had a normal developmental trajectory does not suddenly, in their early 20s become antisocial personality disorder. So I think that's important to remember when you're trying to evaluate an individual that you're working with or that you're concerned about. I also would say this, while there is ADHD is certainly a risk factor for later antisocial personality disorder. ADHD in childhood increases the risk of antisocial personality disorder, but it certainly is a much lower risk than if the child has conduct disorder. So the conduct disorder is a requirement for the diagnosis, and only a quarter of those with conduct disorder will ever have antisocial personality disorder. So I just want to say that because I know ADHD is much more common disorder than conduct disorder, but there's some concern, but it's certainly not, again, a one-to-one kind of a match. All right, so let's talk about some of the neurobiology associated with this, because there's a large number of neurological issues that have been found in individuals with antisocial personality disorder that help us understand why they behave the way they do. And it'll help us kind of tie back together some of this stuff in the context of why some of these risk factors are predictive of antisocial personality disorder, and why some of these early diagnoses even are linked in. So there's going to be really two areas of the brain that we're particularly interested in, although a large number of neurological and neurobiological differences have been found. We're just going to focus on two. The first is the prefrontal cortex, and you can see that marked off here in this diagram. The prefrontal cortex is involved in planning, empathy, looking at consequences, the regulation of emotions, self-awareness, and then morality. This is where this a lot of times this is what people say separates us from the animals type of thing. This allows us for that higher thinking, for the planning ahead or recognition of consequences to come, the good and the bad decisions that we make, recognizing good and bad. And so that's our prefrontal cortex. Okay, we're going to talk about that in the context of antisocial personality disorder. And then there's the amygdala. It's those small red dots that you see there in the temporal lobes. That's a front shot of the brain there, looking at the brainstem. And so that's looking directly at the brain from the front. And amygdala is involved in emotional learning, assessing threat, and the generation of fear or anger, and then the regulation of emotions. So if your amygdala is activated, then you're beginning to have that kind of fight or flight response. And the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex works in conjunction. So the amygdala, assesses the environment for threat. It sees that something might be a threat, and then your prefrontal cortex says, "Okay, hold on just a second. Let's evaluate this. Let's see what the consequences would be if I did this. Let's look at this in relationship to some other memories we have and what happened then." So you like to think about one as kind of the driver, the amygdala is the driver, and the prefrontal cortex is kind of like the brake, and that's where your impulse control comes from, your prefrontal cortex. And so you might get angry at somebody, and your amygdala is going anger, anger, anger. Maybe I should hit this person, and your prefrontal cortex says, "Hang on, don't hit this person. He's your boss. If you hit your boss, you're going to get fired. It's okay to be angry." But let's calm ourselves down. Let's get out of this room. Let's control our behavior. The consequences would outweigh our present anger. And so it kind of controls the way we respond. Okay, so those are the two things we have to understand here. So now let's Let's look at a PET scan of an individual, a control subject, and then an individual with antisocial personality disorder. And if you look at this, you can see both the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala on here. So if you look on the normal control, you can see in this PET scan, and in a PET scan, what you do is you give the individual radioactive glucose, and your brain only uses glucose for nutrients. And so when your brain is activated during a task, it will absorb more glucose because it needs more nutrient. And then you can see where that radioactive glucose was absorbed, and the areas in which it is absorbed into are more active than those areas that are not. And in this task, which typically when you're working with antisocial personality disorder subjects is some type of a task that involves is emotional processing or anger or fear, threat, things like that. And in this instance, you can see in the normal control, you can see that the medial prefrontal cortex you can see that's all, all lit up, a lot of glucose is being activated. And then here in the amygdala, really it's more along these edges here, but you can see that there's a lot more activation in the amygdala as well. And that's perfectly normal. That's what you'd expect in a task like that. But if you look over here in the subject with antisocial personality disorder, you can see the medial prefrontal cortex is really not activated, and the amygdala is dark. There's really nothing going on there. So in this instance, what that tells us is that in this task that has to do with emotional processing and emotional learning and decision making, the amygdala is not activated, so there's no threat is being recognized, and the medial prefrontal cortex is not coming on, and so whatever actions are being taken, there's no thought of the consequences or planning. Actions are just taken. It's very impulsive in nature. And that's what we have to understand is happening for the person with antisocial personality disorder. And we have to not just look at that in the context of them as an adult. We have to think about that's how they have grown up. And so let's imagine for a moment that you're an individual that because of your neurobiology, because of what has happened to you in utero or the genetics that you have, or because of the trauma and experiences that you experience as a very young child, your amygdala is underactivated, meaning that it simply doesn't come on. It doesn't get activated. It doesn't assess threat effectively in the environment. It doesn't generate anxiety for you. You don't generate fear very easily. And the same thing with your medial prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex just doesn't activate very much. So you don't have very good impulse control. And so you don't have very good attention. And you just kind of trial and error through life. You just do what you do. And so you're a child and you do something wrong. Okay. You do something wrong and you were punished for that. Okay. Well, because your amygdala never activated and you never evaluated the consequences of what this action would be, you never associate those consequences with your action and you just do it again. One of the things that keeps us on the straight and narrow and kind of doing what we might do is our amygdala says, hey, don't do that because you're going to get in trouble. Don't speed when you're on the interstate because we just saw a police officer 1 mile back. We all know that if we see a police officer, we all slow down regardless of how fast we're going. And that's because you anticipate the consequences of what it would be for you to get a ticket. So you want to slow down. Well, the person with antisocial personality disorder, their brain doesn't work like that. They don't have that kind of generation of anxiety or fear that kind of helps them learn what they should and should not do. And then when they're put into a situation in which they have to make a decision, they simply just make a decision, not based on the consequences or not based on any concern for what may happen, just whatever they feel is best for them, they just simply do. If they see something they want, they take it. You don't go into a store and just take something because you know that if you take something, you may end up in jail and you don't want to go to jail and it may ruin your life and you may lose your job and you may lose your family and whatever. They don't worry about that. They just do it because they wanted the object. And so they're very impulsive and they just act without thinking. But there's no fear generation. So, one of the things that's very interesting that's, for instance, been done with psychopaths, which again, psychopaths are a kind of a special subset of people with antisocial personality disorder, is called anticipatory anxiety. So you take an individual and you rig up their fingers to be shocked during a very simple task where they just watch a screen and a number comes up on the screen. and it's a countdown. So it's like a countdown for a rocket taking off: 10, 9, 8, 7. So they know that at 1, they will be shocked. Okay. On the other finger, you have some measures of skin conductance, which is really a measure of how much you're sweating, which again is a measure of kind of your activation or your arousal, because the more anxiety you begin to have, the more sweat that appears on your fingers. And so you probably don't even notice it most of the time. So as you're measuring that, what you find is that in a normal individual, a person without psychopathy, they, as the number gets closer to the 1, they're showing higher and higher levels of anxiety, higher and higher levels of physiological arousal, because they know what's going to happen when they get to 1. It's called anticipatory anxiety. When we get to 1, they're going to shock me. And so as it gets closer to 1, it's higher, higher, higher. They get shocked, and then it drops back down. So then it's higher, 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 drops back down. Okay. For the psychopath, it's almost like a flat line. 10, 9. So what's happening at 9 is the same as what's happening at 2. There's no sense of the consequence of what's going to occur. There's no anticipatory anxiety. I know you're going to shock me, but I'm not learning from the experiences, and I don't really generate any anxiety. So just shock me. I don't really learn anything from that. And so imagine if you had to grow up as a child and that's how you are. And then imagine how your parents react to you, or imagine how society reacts to you, your teachers, law enforcement. And so the child is, ultimately their behavior causes them to be shunned and shamed and isolated from society, which then kind of builds into this, puts them into a trajectory to be connected with a deviant peer group, to be involved in substance use, to be involved in criminality, because that's where they can find connection. And it's really kind of, unfortunately, a self-fulfilling prophecy that the individual is, in a sense, kind of doomed from the beginning, because it's not recognized really what's going on. Now, there are wonderful interventions for children who are struggling with these types of problems, but unfortunately, early on, a lot of times are just looked at as very much behavior disordered and looked at as kind of bad kids. And that's a real shame, because there's a real opportunity to intervene and change that trajectory. So what we're looking at, again, is dysfunction in the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex, and really just a dysfunction in the limbic system in general, which is a system involved in emotional processing and emotional learning. And we can look at a whole other set of things. And a lot of this occurs neurodevelopmentally. It's there when the individual is born, but it also could result from abuse or neglect, or environmental factors as well. So what can we do with an individual that has antisocial personality disorder? Are we actually able to treat that individual? There are treatments. I will say personality disorders in general are very difficult to treat because they are very rigid and kind of non-changing kind of behavioral patterns and cognitive patterns. The other problem with antisocial personality disorder particularly is that it's rare for the individual to recognize that they are the problem, that they have a problem. They tend to blame their problems on society around them, or their lack of success or their lack of achievement as a result of outside factors, and now they kind of respond in a kind of an aggressive and angry way back at society to kind of get back at it. But for those who do recognize that they have a problem or do want to make a change, which are very important factors in recovery, the behavioral therapies, cognitive behavior therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, have both been shown to be effective in helping individuals with antisocial personality disorder. Although, again, I would say it's a very long process, it's very time consuming. And unfortunately, even many of those who begin will drop out. It is very difficult to treat these individuals because, again, most of the time they don't see themselves as having a more of a mental health problem. They see more of a victim of society type of a thing. And then, more commonly what is done is the coexisting conditions are treated, and it certainly helps the individual have a better quality of life. Substance abuse, as I said, is extremely common in individuals with antisocial personality disorder. And so an individual with antisocial personality disorder that can become sober and no longer use substances is certainly going to be better off than a person who is using. And depression is also very common in these individuals because while they may not necessarily recognize that they have a mental health related issue, They certainly recognize that they are not where they want to be. They recognize that they are an outcast for society and that they're struggling, and that causes them to be very depressed. So focusing on these kind of coexisting conditions can make a big difference. And there are some medications that can be used. They not really treat specifically antisocial personality disorder, but antidepressants, certainly SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and also some mood stabilizing agents like some of the anti-epileptic agents that are used in bipolar disorder to control mood swings can be used to help an individual have better impulse control for those who feel that they actually have an issue. And so again, really one of the hard things to overcome with the individual is for them to recognize that they actually have a problem, and that problem is internal, and that it can be helped in some way through a therapeutic approach. It's not common for individuals with antisocial personality disorder to come into a clinic setting because of their antisocial personality disorder. It's quite common for them to come into substance use settings because of their substance use. It's not uncommon for them to come into clinical settings because of their depression. But it's not common for someone to come in specifically about their antisocial personality disorder. All right, so in the last little bit here before we get into questions, let's talk about what we might do for families that are living with an individual who has antisocial personality disorder. Unfortunately, individuals with antisocial personality disorder are at a much higher risk of dying as a result of violence earlier than the general population, be that self-inflicted violence, suicide, or violence from others. And that's primarily because of the criminal activity and aggressive behavior that they're involved in. So that's an ongoing problem. But there's a number of things that families can take into account as they try to work with someone who has antisocial personality disorder. Number one, there's no reason to argue with the individual. You're not going to convince them that their behavior is wrong and that they should change. Arguing with them goes nowhere. It's not that you have to accept their behavior, but trying to talk them out of their behavior when we've already looked at some neurobiological differences that exist is simply just a wasted, kind of a futile attempt. And so there's no reason to be involved in arguments. You need to focus on the choices that you make and the choices that they make. And then you need to set clear boundaries for what you will do for them and what you allow them to do around you. There needs to be, like I said, the boundaries need to be clear. And there need to be clear consequences for violating those boundaries. So for instance, let's say one of your boundaries is you will not use illegal substances in our home. Okay, and so if the individual is found to have illegal substances in the home, then there's a consequence for that, whatever that consequence may be, and that consequence is brought out. If the individual uses substances outside the house, that's a different issue, but they're not to have them in the house. So they should be boundaries that are achievable by the individual, but that protect the rest of the family from the negative behaviors of the individual. You need to expect pushback, but you need to be consistent in the boundaries and consistent in the consequences. And again, it's all about choices. They are making choices and you're making choices. And so you need to be careful that that you remember this is not your fault. It is not your fault that they have antisocial personality disorder. But it is up to you to make sure that you don't enable bad behavior. So if a 19-year-old person with antisocial personality disorder is constantly asking their parents for money, and they know that every time they give them money, they go out and they buy methamphetamine with it and use it, well, you're enabling their behavior. You have to not do that. And so you might say, well, then they get aggressive and we have to walk on eggshells all the time. Well, that's better to do that than enable bad behavior. And that's likely to change over time. But if you continue to enable the bad behavior, it's just going to continue. So those boundaries are very, very important. And then you have to get support for yourself. You can't, don't want to do this on your own. It's important to, maybe be involved in a support group or have a group of friends that you can talk through about this. There are plenty of support groups for individuals that have loved ones that are struggling with mental health problems, and they can be tremendously helpful. And I think maybe the greatest hope for an individual who has a loved one who has antisocial personality disorder is the fact that, what the research shows us is if these individuals can make it into their 40s and 50s, there is a plateauing of their behavior. They actually do get better. Most of that is not because their cognitive process change. It's just that, a 45-year-old man is not a 22-year-old young male anymore. He can't get in fights as easily and come out of those unscathed. He probably has more responsibilities that are kind of holding him down. Just the physical aspects of being older slows an individual down, and they're not as likely to be involved in some of these behaviors. And so there is what is often referred to as the antisocial or the psychopath plateau. And as a person moves into their 40s and 50s, they tend to kind of mellow out some. They won't go back. They won't be just a perfectly normal individual who doesn't lie or manipulate or things like that, but they're less likely to be involved in overt criminal behavior, particularly aggression and assault. And they simply, are less likely to be involved in some of these criminal activities, and they can be much more easily dealt with as an individual. So there is that also to understand, is that the plateau is there, and so it happens sometimes somewhere in the 40s to 50s typically. Again, the problem is a lot of these individuals don't ever make it to their 40s or 50s because of their heavy drug use or their involvement in criminal activity and aggression. Ultimately leads to them having an accident or being killed, or ultimately being incarcerated as well. So